Empire of Blood. Episode 1. I Will Make Them Beg, Sulla, Rome. 82 BCE. A production of Empire of Blood. Rome, November, 82 BCE. The sun has barely cleared the rooftops of the Palatine Hill when the soldiers arrive at the Forum. They do not come with drawn swords. They do not come with war drums or battle cries. They come quietly, efficiently, the way men who have already won come to consolidate a victory. They carry hammers and wooden boards, and they move with the practiced calm of men who have done unpleasant things before and expect to do unpleasant things again, and who have learned that the best way to endure that kind of work is not to think about it too hard. They nail a board to the rostra. That is all they do. They nail a board to the rostra, and they walk away. The rostra is the great speaker's platform at the heart of the Roman Forum, the place where orators have stood for centuries to address the people, to argue law, to celebrate triumph, to mourn the dead. It is the symbolic center of Roman public life. Its name comes from the iron beaks of defeated warships, rostra, the prows, stripped from the enemies of Rome and bolted to the platform as trophies. It is a monument to Roman power. And on this cold November morning, someone has nailed a wooden board to it. People gather. They always gather. Romans have always gathered at the Forum the way people gather at disasters, the way human beings cannot help but turn toward whatever terrible thing is happening nearest to them. And there is something about this particular morning, something in the quality of the soldiers who placed the board, something in the silence they left behind, that tells the people of Rome that whatever is written on that board is going to change everything. So they crowd forward, they push and strain to see, and the ones at the front go quiet. The board contains a list of names, 80 names at first, 80 men, senators, some of them, equestrians, former officials, men whose families have lived in Rome for generations. Beside each name, a description of the man, enough to identify him clearly. And beneath the list, an announcement from the new dictator, the man who 3 weeks ago won the Battle of the Colline Gate and made himself master of Rome. The announcement says this: any man on this list is an outlaw. He has no rights. He has no protection under Roman law. Any citizen of Rome who encounters such a man may kill him immediately, without consequence, and will receive a reward for doing so. 2 talents of silver, a fortune by any measure. 2 talents, whether you are a Roman citizen or a freed slave. 2 talents if you are a slave yourself, though you will also receive your freedom. The property of every man on the list will be confiscated by the state, his estates auctioned, his money absorbed. His sons and grandsons are barred from holding public office. Forever. The word the dictator uses for this process is prescriptio. A prescription, a list, something clinical, bureaucratic, orderly, a list. For a moment, the crowd doesn't react. The people at the front who have read the board stand very still, and the people behind them can't see yet. And there is this strange, suspended second where Rome has not yet fully understood what has just been done to it. And then someone towards the back shouts a question. Whose names are on it? Are they enemies? Are they the men who lost the war? And someone at the front answers. And then you can hear it. Not screaming. Not yet. Something worse than screaming. The sound of people checking. Men grabbing each other by the shoulder asking, do you know anyone on that list? Is my name there? Is your name there? Turn around. Let me see. Step aside. I need to see. The sound of the Roman elite discovering that the state they believed in, the state they served, the state they were promised, was being restored by the victorious general who just won the civil war. That state has just put a price on its own citizens' heads. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about what the Roman Republic was, what it was supposed to be. For 5 centuries, the Romans had been almost hysterically proud of not being a monarchy. They had expelled their kings. They had built an entire political system. 2 consuls, term limits, a senate, a complex web of competing magistracies, specifically to prevent any one man from having the power to simply decide who lived and who died. Roman law was elaborate, sometimes Byzantine, often frustrating, but it existed precisely to protect citizens from the raw exercise of power. You had rights in Rome. You had the right to a trial. You had the right to appeal. Even when men were executed by the state, it followed procedure. It followed form. It went through the apparatus of law. Until now, when a wooden board nailed to the rostra announces that the procedure is whatever the dictator says it is. The list will grow. It will grow for months. By the time Lucius Cornelius Sulla is done, ancient sources estimate that roughly 1,500 Roman nobles have been killed. Modern historians suspect the real number of total victims, including freedmen, slaves, associates, runs far higher. The proscriptions will last until Sulla decides they are finished. Men will be added to the lists based on political convenience, personal grudges, ancient debts. A man named Quinctius will be proscribed because Sulla wants his fish pond. The fish pond. A man's life, his family's future, measured against the dictator's desire for a better view of the water. Within days of that first board being nailed to the rostra, Rome will look like a city in the grip of a fever. Bounty hunters move through the streets. Slaves watch their masters for signs of fear. Old debts become pretexts for denunciation. Friends discover that 2 talents of silver is worth more than loyalty. The severed heads of proscribed men begin appearing in the forum, displayed there on poles, presented to Sulla for identification, left to rot in the autumn air as a message to everyone who passes. This is the Rome that Lucius Cornelius Sulla made. Consider what it means for a society to produce this moment. Consider the centuries of labor that went into building the Roman Forum as a physical space, the accumulated meaning embedded in its stones. The rostra itself is covered in the bronze beaks of Carthaginian and other enemy warships. Trophies of Roman military supremacy, declarations in metal that Rome wins its wars, that Rome endures, that Rome is the kind of civilization that nails the weapons of defeated enemies to its public monuments as reminders of its own permanence. And on a cold November morning, a wooden board is nailed to that monument, and the accumulated meaning of 500 years runs up against the fact of a list. The names on the board are real people. They have families, routines, favorite food stalls in the market, opinions about chariot racing and the quality of this year's grain supply. They have clients who depend on them and patrons who sponsor them and slaves who serve them and freedmen who owe them loyalty. They are embedded in the social fabric of Rome in 1,000 small ways, and now each of them is worth 2 talents of silver to whoever finds them first. One name that barely misses appearing on the early lists is Quintus Lutatius Catullus, a man of the most distinguished family, a former consul, someone who would in ordinary times be entirely beyond reach of this kind of treatment. He manages to negotiate, to make himself useful enough to Sulla in the reconstruction that his name is held back. But the fact that it was even considered, the fact that a former consul has to negotiate for his life, tells you what the proscription system actually is. It is not a list of enemies, it is a statement of principle. The principle being, anyone can be on the list, anyone. The category of the protected and the category of the killable are no longer defined by who you are or what you have done. They are defined by what one man with an army decides. Julius Caesar is 19 years old when the proscriptions begin. His father died when he was 15, and in the years since he has been building his position carefully, navigating the complicated politics of late Republican Rome with the instincts of a young man who understands that his survival depends on reading the room correctly. He is connected to Marius through his Aunt Julia, the wife of the great general. He is connected to Cinna, Sulla's main enemy in Rome during the years of the Eastern Campaign, through his own wife, Cornelia. These are the connections of a well-placed young man from a distinguished family who made prudent political alliances. Under the prescription system, these connections are death warrants. Sulla orders Caesar to divorce Cornelia. Caesar refuses. Sulla orders his priestly offices stripped and his property confiscated. Caesar goes into hiding. He moves through the Sabine hills north of Rome, staying in the houses of people who shelter him. And sheltering a proscribed man's relative is itself a risky act, which means the people who hide Caesar are doing something genuinely courageous in a Rome where courage has been made very expensive. He gets ill. He bribes soldiers who discover him. He survives somehow, as 19-year-old boys with remarkable futures sometimes do. When Caesar is eventually pardoned, through the intercession of his mother's family, who are connected to Sulla's inner circle, Sulla apparently says something to the people pleading Caesar's case that they will remember for a long time. In that young man, Sulla says, I see many Mariuses. He is right, of course. Caesar will be many things that Sulla was, and some things that Sulla was not. And the Rome that Caesar eventually inherits will be a Rome shaped in every important way by the precedent Sulla established on this cold November morning, at this wooden board, at this list. But here is the question that will drive everything that follows. Here is the question that keeps this story from being simply a history of one man's cruelty and makes it instead something much more disturbing, much more relevant, much harder to set aside. Sulla did not invent the violence. The violence was already there. He did not invent the ambition, the political terror, the military strongmen. Rome had been producing all of those for decades before he arrived. What Sulla invented was something more precise, more dangerous, and more lasting than any of those things. He invented the bureaucracy of atrocity. He took mass murder and gave it paperwork. He took the extermination of political enemies and turned it into law. And once you do that, once you make the machinery of the state itself into the instrument of murder, you have changed something fundamental about what a state can be and do and justify. You have shown every ambitious man who comes after you that the institutions meant to constrain power can be turned inside out and used to amplify it instead. Julius Caesar will study Sulla carefully. Augustus will study Caesar. And the Roman Republic, the system Sulla claimed he was saving, will be dead within 50 years. Stay with me. We are going all the way back to the beginning. Before we talk about the man, we need to talk about the machine he was born into. Because Sulla did not create the conditions that made the prescriptions possible from scratch. He was the product of a specific civilization at a specific moment of stress, and to understand what he chose to do, you have to understand what options the Rome of his time made available to a man of his temperament. Rome in the 2nd century BCE is the most successful military organization the ancient Mediterranean world has ever seen. That sounds like an abstraction. It is not. What it means, concretely, is this. Beginning roughly around 260 BCE and accelerating dramatically through the following century and a half, Rome fought a series of wars that transformed it from a regional power in central Italy into the dominant force across the entire Mediterranean basin. The Punic Wars against Carthage, the Macedonian Wars, the wars against the Seleucid Empire in the east. And then, in one extraordinary year, 146 BCE, Rome destroys 2 of the greatest cities in the ancient world simultaneously. Carthage, on the North African coast, burned for 17 days. The Romans salted the earth. They enslaved the survivors. They obliterated the city so completely that for decades afterward, the site was barely inhabited. In the same year, Greek Corinth was sacked and burned, its population sold into slavery, its treasures carted back to Rome. 146 BCE. 2 civilizations erased. Rome is not yet 2/3 of the way through its republican period. What this military expansion produces is a cascade of consequences that will take a century to fully work themselves out. And by fully working themselves out, I mean they will produce Sulla, and Caesar after him, and Augustus after that, and the death of the Republic as a functioning system. But in the moment, in the mid-2nd century, BCE, what people see is wealth. Staggering, almost incomprehensible quantities of wealth pouring into Rome. Gold and silver from Spanish mines, grain from North Africa and Sicily, slaves, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people from every corner of the conquered world, many of them educated Greeks who become tutors and secretaries and administrators, many more of them destined for the Italian farms and the Spanish mines. And here is where the trouble starts. Wealth is not neutral. It flows toward power, and power decides where it goes from there. In Rome, power belongs to the senatorial class, roughly 300 families who have monopolized political office for generations, who sit in the Senate, who hold the consulships and the praetorships, who govern the provinces. These families see the flood of conquest wealth as confirming what they have always believed, that Rome's success is their success, that the empire exists to serve the interests of the people who built it, that this is simply the natural order of things. But the natural order of things has a problem. The Roman army, the army that made all this conquest possible, was built on a particular social foundation. Roman soldiers were not mercenaries, not professionals in our modern sense. They were citizens, small farmers who took up arms when Rome needed them and returned to their land when the campaign was done. This was both a practical arrangement and a deeply ideological one. The Romans believed that men who owned land had a stake in Rome's survival, that they would fight harder for something they personally had to lose. Property ownership was not just a financial fact in Republican Rome. It was a civic identity. The conquests destroyed this. When Rome's armies went to war in Spain or Macedonia or North Africa, they were gone for years. The small farmers who made up the legions came home to find their land neglected, mortgaged, or in some cases simply purchased, legally or otherwise, by the wealthy. The slave economy flooding Italy with cheap agricultural labor meant that these small farms, even when they survived, could not compete economically. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Italy was filling up with a new kind of person, the dispossessed citizen, the man who used to farm his own land and now has nothing, who lives in the city on the edge of poverty, who still has his citizenship and his right to vote, but who has nothing else, no property, no stake in the system, no reason to feel that the great Roman project has anything to do with him. This is a structural catastrophe that has been building for decades, and in 133 BCE, a man named Tiberius Gracchus decides to do something about it. Tiberius Gracchus comes from one of Rome's most distinguished families. He is the grandson of Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal. He served in the army, saw the Italian countryside stripped of small farmers, and concluded, not unreasonably, that Rome was eating itself. His solution was a land reform proposal. Redistribute some of the public land that the wealthy had been illegally occupying to the landless poor. Give people back their stake. The Senate killed him. Literally. A mob of senators and their followers, led by the Pontifex Maximus of all people, surrounded Tiberius Gracchus in the street and beat him to death with chairs and clubs. His body was thrown in the Tiber. 300 of his supporters were also killed. This is the first large-scale political murder in the Roman Republic's history. And here is the thing about first times. They are never entirely the last time. Once you have established that political violence is an available option, that the murder of a citizen politician with a popular following is something that can be done and survived, you have changed the calculus for everyone. You have said, in effect, that the rules are not actually rules. They are suggestions, and suggestions can be ignored by sufficiently motivated men. 12 years later, in 121 BCE, Tiberius's brother, Gaius Gracchus, attempts similar reforms. He is also killed, along with roughly 3,000 of his supporters. Some executed, some hunted down afterward. The Senate passes a special emergency decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which essentially suspends normal legal protections in the name of defending the state. Mark that phrase, defending the state. We will hear it again. By the time Sulla enters the story, Roman political life has been soaking in this precedent for decades. The murder of a tribune, the killing of thousands of citizens, the use of emergency powers to bypass normal legal protections. All of this is in the recent past, within living memory. The Republic's commitment to the rule of law has already been fatally compromised. What Sulla will do is not unprecedented in kind. It is unprecedented in scale, in organization, in the cold efficiency with which he industrializes what his predecessors did in bursts of panic and rage. But there is one more development we need to understand before Sulla arrives, and it might be the most important one. In 107 BCE, a military commander named Gaius Marius reforms the Roman army. Before Marius, the property requirement for military service had kept the army tied to the landowning classes. Marius eliminates the property requirement. He opens the legions to the landless poor, the very people the Gracchian crisis had produced in such vast numbers. And he sweetens the deal. Soldiers in Marius's reformed army expect their general to provide for them after their service is done, to secure them land grants, bonuses, a future. The Senate is supposed to ratify these arrangements, but Marius makes it personal. His veterans feel their loyalty to him, not to the Senate that might or might not honor his promises. What Marius has created, without perhaps fully understanding what he has done, is the personal army. An army whose soldiers owe their livelihood, their future, their everything to their commander, rather than to the abstract institution of Rome. An army that will follow its general, not because he represents Rome, but because he is their patron, their protector, the man who stands between them and a future with nothing in it. He has created the engine that will destroy the Republic. Because if an army's loyalty is personal rather than institutional, then a sufficiently charismatic, sufficiently powerful general can use that army for anything, including marching it on Rome. No one has done that yet, but the capability now exists. And capabilities, in history as in physics, tend toward expression. There is a way of thinking about republican systems that treats their collapse as inevitable, that says any sufficiently powerful state will tend toward authoritarianism, that the republican moment is always temporary, that the question is not whether, but when. This is a comfortable reading because it removes individual moral weight from the people who make specific choices. The Republic fell in this reading because republics fall the way fruit falls from trees, mechanically, without requiring anyone to be particularly bad. This is wrong. Or rather, it is only half right in a way that makes it more wrong than simply false. The structural pressures on the Roman Republic in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE were real. The wealth concentration, the breakdown of the small farmer class, the personal armies, the political violence, all of these were genuine forces that the Republic's institutions were struggling to contain. They create a range of possible outcomes, a space within which different choices could lead to different results. Within that space, individual decisions matter. Tiberius Gracchus chose to push his land reform through the popular assembly, rather than negotiating with the Senate, which escalated the conflict. The senators who killed him chose mob violence over any other response. Marius chose to open the army to the landless poor in a way that shifted military loyalty without creating new institutional structures to manage it. And Sulla chose to march on Rome. Sulla chose the prescriptions. Sulla chose to invent the legal machinery of political murder. He did not have to. This is worth saying plainly because the counterfactual is important. When Sulla seized Rome in 88 BCE and found his political enemies in disarray, he had options. He could have used his military supremacy to force a negotiated settlement. He could have used the moment for constitutional reform without the accompanying terror. Other powerful men in Roman history had won civil conflicts and then governed with something approaching restraint. He did not. And understanding why he did not requires understanding not just the Roman context, but the specific character of Sulla as a person and the specific incentive structures that the earlier history of violence had created. Roman political culture in the 1st century BCE had been marinating in the memory of Gracchian violence for 2 generations. The lesson the Roman elite drew from the murder of Tiberius Gracchus was not that political murder is wrong and self-defeating. It would have been possible to draw that lesson, and some people did, but that political murder sometimes works. The senatorial elite preserved its position through violence, and the Republic continued, and nothing catastrophic resulted, at least not immediately. This looks from a certain distance like the violence was justified by its results. This is the logic of short-term thinking applied to long-term structural problems, and it is one of the most consistent engines of institutional decay in human history. The violence that works in the short term creates the conditions for worse violence in the medium term and for catastrophe in the long term, but the people making the short-term decision experience the short-term success, not the long-term disaster, and so the lesson they internalize is violence works. Sulla internalizes this lesson completely. He's a very good student, and Rome, being Rome, has been an excellent teacher. The Republic has been building toward him for a century. Every murdered tribune, every emergency decree, every soldier whose loyalty runs to his general rather than his city, all of it has been assembling the conditions for one man to do what Sulla is about to do. The board is nailed to the rostra. The list begins. There is a story Sulla tells about himself, or at least that the ancient sources attribute to him, and it appears near the beginning of his career. He is a young officer serving under Gaius Marius in North Africa during the Jugurthine War, the campaign against the Numidian king Jugurtha that Rome has been fighting, badly, for years. It is 85 or 86 BCE, and Sulla has been sent on a diplomatic mission to negotiate with a neighboring king named Bocchus, to bring Bocchus over to Rome's side, to use Bocchus as the means of capturing Jugurtha. This is delicate work, political work, the kind of thing that can go wrong in 100 ways. Sulla is young, relatively junior, not yet a man of enormous reputation. He sits across from a foreign king and a court of strangers with uncertain loyalties and negotiates the delivery of a man, a king, into Roman captivity. And he pulls it off. Jugurtha is delivered into Sulla's hands. The war, which has dragged on for years, is essentially over. And Sulla is so proud of this moment, so aware that it represents the defining achievement of his early career, that he has a signet ring made. The ring depicts the scene of Jugurtha's surrender. Bocchus on one side, Sulla in the center, Jugurtha kneeling. He wears this ring. He uses it as his seal. Gaius Marius, who commands the army, who by the rules of Roman tradition should receive the credit for the victory, is furious. Remember that ring. Because everything that follows, the civil wars, the proscriptions, the murder of thousands, begins in the psychology of a man who needs people to know what he did, who refuses to accept that someone else will get credit for his work, who will spend the next 30 years of his life making Rome understand that Lucius Cornelius Sulla cannot be ignored or diminished or pushed aside. He is born in 138 BCE, which makes him roughly a generation younger than Marius, the man who will become his great rival. The Cornelii are one of the most ancient patrician clans in Rome, the family of Scipio Africanus, the defeater of Hannibal, the greatest general Rome had produced to that point. This is an extraordinary lineage. But lineage in Rome is not the same as wealth or influence, and by Sulla's time the Cornelii Sullae, his particular branch of the family, have fallen into what the Romans politely called modest circumstances, and what Sulla himself would have experienced as something close to genteel poverty. His father had not accumulated significant property. His stepmother left him some money when she died. He is an aristocrat by birth and something much more precarious in practice. This combination, the ancient name, the expected status, the conspicuously insufficient resources to maintain it, creates a specific kind of personality. The Roman elite lived by display. Your house, your clothes, your retinue, your capacity to give lavish dinners and support political clients. These were not luxuries. They were the currency of social and political power. A man who could not maintain them was falling visibly in real time in front of everyone who mattered. And Sulla, as a young man, simply does not have what he is supposed to have. He adapts. Plutarch tells us that Sulla spent his early years in cheap lodgings in Rome, sharing rented rooms with freedmen and low-class citizens, socializing with actors and mimes and the kind of people that aristocrats were supposed to regard with contempt. This is not what Roman sources present as a scandal exactly. Plutarch seems more bemused than horrified. But it tells us something important. Sulla was forced by his circumstances to exist in spaces that his birth told him he should not have to inhabit. He became fluent in parts of Roman life that most men of his class never encountered. He drank with people his peers would not sit next to. He told jokes and performed and charmed and survived. He was, by all accounts, extraordinarily good at this. Ancient sources are consistent on the point that Sulla was personally magnetic in a way that is hard to fully translate across 2,000 years. His soldiers loved him, not respected him, not feared him, loved him in the complicated way that Roman soldiers loved good commanders, which was partly admiration for competence and partly something more personal. The sense that this man saw them, knew their names, shared their discomforts, would drink with them around the campfire, and be somehow simultaneously approachable and impressive. He had a talent for making people feel chosen, special. Like being in Sulla's presence was itself a distinction. But there is another Sulla underneath the charm, a colder one. Plutarch, who is not an uncritical source but who had access to materials we no longer have, draws a careful portrait of a man who contained extreme poles in close proximity. Generous to friends, he writes, implacable to enemies. And the capacity for implacability was, when finally released, of a depth and consistency that seems to have surprised, even people who thought they knew him. There is something almost dissociative about the way Sulla could shift between the modes. The laughing, affectionate, broadly human man who composed light verse and drank with his troops, and the administrative coldness of the man who sat down and compiled lists of people who needed to die. He inherits two fortunes before his career really begins. An old mistress leaves him money, then a wealthy stepmother does the same. Suddenly, Sulla has resources commensurate with his name. He can enter politics. He can compete. His first real military experience comes in North Africa, serving under Marius in the Jugurthine War. And here we get back to that ring. Sulla is a natural soldier in a way that is somewhat counterintuitive given his background. He is not a blunt instrument. He is not the kind of commander who wins by brute force or overwhelming numbers. He thinks. He is patient. Systematically patient in a way that military historians tend to admire. Because real patience in warfare is rarer than courage. He is good at logistics, which is the unglamorous competence that actually wins wars. And he is good at what we might now call special operations. The kinds of missions that require personal daring combined with strategic thinking, the ability to improvise under pressure. The capture of Jugurtha is the perfect expression of all of this. It requires Sulla to operate independently, far from Marius, in a foreign court with unreliable allies, managing a negotiation where the stakes are enormous and the margin for error is zero. He operates through Bacchus with a patience and subtlety that the situation demands, playing on the Numidian king's fears and ambitions simultaneously, never showing his hand prematurely, and he succeeds, completely. And then Marius takes the credit, or rather, and this is more precise and more important, the structure of Roman military command gives the credit to Marius, who is the commanding general. Sulla knows this. He knew it when he signed up. But knowing the rules and accepting the emotional reality of them are different things, and Sulla, with his theatrical ring, with his private seething, does not accept it. This rivalry with Marius will define the next 2 decades of Sulla's life and ultimately the next decade of Rome's. Let us be precise about what kind of intelligence Sulla has, because it matters enormously for understanding what he does with it. Sulla is not an ideologue. This is important and often underappreciated. He does not have a theory of the state or a vision of a better Rome that he is working toward with philosophical conviction. The reforms he eventually implements as dictator are real and reasonably sophisticated, but they are the work of a man who understands how power operates rather than a man driven by ideas about how it should operate. What Sulla has instead of ideology is something more primal and more effective in the short term, an extraordinarily refined sense of what he is owed, and an absolutely remorseless willingness to collect it. The ancient sources are consistent on this point across different authors with different biases. Sulla believed, at a fundamental level, that he was the most capable man of his generation, that this was simply a fact visible to anyone who looked clearly, and that the Roman system's failure to reward capability with proportionate recognition was not merely frustrating but actively unjust. This is not an unusual belief. Most people of exceptional ability have some version of it. But Sulla has it in an especially pure, especially intractable form, and the combination of that belief with his specific circumstances creates something volatile. He serves in other campaigns. He distinguishes himself in the social war, that near-catastrophic rebellion by Rome's Italian allies that erupts in 91 BCE. The Italians had been fighting Rome's wars for generations, dying in Rome's legions, contributing to Rome's wealth, and being denied the full citizenship that would give them a real political stake in the empire they were helping to build. When the Senate refuses yet again to extend citizenship to the Italian allies, The allies decide to secede. They create their own state. They call it Italia. They issue their own coins, and they very nearly win. Sulla is brilliant in the social war. He holds the southern front, defeats a series of Italian commanders, demonstrates a tactical flexibility and an aggression that draws favorable attention. He also demonstrates something that will become important later, a willingness to use brutality strategically. When a town falls to his forces, and the population needs to be taught a lesson that other towns will remember, Sulla teaches it. He is not sadistic in the way that some ancient commanders appear to have been. He does not seem to take pleasure in cruelty for its own sake. He is practical. Violence is a tool, and he uses it with the same efficiency he brings to logistics. He is elected consul for 88 BCE, the top magistracy of the Roman Republic, the office that makes him one of the two most powerful men in Rome for that year. And then everything accelerates. The Senate assigns Sulla command of the war against Mithridates, the sixth of Pontus. Mithridates is the king of a large territory in what is now northern Turkey, and he has spent the last several years establishing himself as the most dangerous enemy Rome faces in the eastern Mediterranean. He is intelligent, militarily capable, and has a talent for anti-Roman propaganda that plays extremely well in the Greek East, where Rome is not universally beloved. In 88 BCE, he orchestrates what ancient sources call the Asian Vespers, a coordinated massacre of Roman and Italian citizens throughout Asia Minor. 80,000 people, perhaps more, killed in a single day on his orders. Rome needs someone to deal with this immediately. The Senate gives the commission to Sulla. Sulla has his army ready, stationed in Campania, preparing for the Eastern campaign. And then Publius Sulpicius Rufus, a tribune of the people and an ally of Marius, passes a law in the popular assembly, a law that transfers command of the Eastern War from Sulla to Marius. To Marius, who is 69 years old, who has been out of major command for years, who Sulla has despised for the better part of 2 decades. Sulla's officers, sent to take over the army on Marius's behalf, are killed by Sulla's soldiers. Mobbed, beaten, killed. The soldiers throw stones. And Sulla, standing among his troops, makes decisions that no Roman commander in 500 years of the Republic had ever made. He marches his army on Rome. He sits them down first. He gives them a speech. Plutarch preserves the substance of it, if not the exact words. The core of the argument is this: the city is in the hands of men who are stealing what rightfully belongs to us. The command was legally assigned to me. They have taken it by political manipulation. We are going to go take it back. Most of his officers refuse to go. 6 of his senior officers, his legates, refuse to march on Rome and leave. The ordinary soldiers stay. Because the ordinary soldiers' loyalty is not to the Republic in the abstract. Their loyalty is to Sulla, who has led them, fed them, fought beside them, promised them rewards. And Sulla, standing before them, is making the very personal argument that what belongs to him, what belongs to them, is being stolen. This is not a political argument about constitutional law. This is a tribal argument about loyalty and betrayal, and the soldiers understand it in those terms. 6 legions march on Rome. The city has almost no military garrison. The Romans had never needed one. The taboo against bringing armies into the city had been strong enough that no one had prepared for its violation. Marius tries to organize resistance with whatever armed men he can find, mostly slaves he has freed for the purpose. It is not enough. Sulla enters Rome. His soldiers fight their way through the streets. Marius and his allies flee for their lives. Sulla stands in Rome with his army around him, master of the city. and he does something that, given what comes later, looks almost restrained. He exiles his enemies. He passes laws. He addresses the Senate. He essentially uses the machinery of the Republic to ratify his coup, dresses it in legal language, tries to make it look like a constitutional act rather than what it actually was, which was a general seizing the capital at sword point. Then he leaves for the east to fight Mithridates. This turns out to be a mistake. As soon as Sulla's legions cross the Adriatic, his enemies in Rome reassert themselves. The consul Cinna, who had sworn to maintain Sulla's settlement and immediately broke his oath, joins with Marius to retake the city. Sulla's supporters are massacred. Heads are displayed in the forum. It is bad, and it is a preview of what Sulla will do when he gets back, because Sulla is watching this from a distance and he is learning. He is learning what happens when you do not finish the job. He is learning that in the kind of Rome that exists now, the Rome where the old rules have been broken, mercy is not a virtue. It is a vulnerability. He spends 5 years in the East. The campaigns against Mithridates are complicated, expensive, politically fraught. Sulla is conducting a war while officially being a public enemy in Rome, his command having been revoked by the faction that retook the city. He cannot get reliable resupply. He is operating in a strange liminal space, a general without a legal mandate fighting a war that Rome needs fought, funding his operations partly through the systematic looting of Greek sanctuaries. He strips the treasuries of Delphi and Olympia, among others. He is not sentimental about this. He needs money and he takes it where it can be found. He is also victorious, eventually and decisively, against Mithridates, forcing a peace settlement in 85 BCE. He negotiates with Mithridates the way he negotiated with Bocchus 30 years earlier. Patience, calculation. The deal gets done. Then he turns west. He lands in Italy in 83 BCE with a hardened veteran army. The men who have spent years fighting in Greece and Asia Minor, who have stormed cities and looted sanctuaries and dragged themselves through the mountain passes of Epirus. These are not the same soldiers who marched on Rome 5 years ago. They have been through something. They are colder, more capable, and more completely Sulla's than any army he has previously commanded. The civil war that follows lasts about a year. It is brutal in the way that civil wars between professional armies are always brutal, because the men on both sides know each other, trained in the same system, understand the same tactics, and have no illusions about what defeat means. No one is expecting mercy. They fight accordingly. The decisive engagement is the Battle of the Colline Gate on the 1st of November, 82 BCE. The Colline Gate is one of the main entrances to the city of Rome, the gate on the northeastern side toward the Tiber. The forces loyal to the Marian faction, Samnites, the last of the Italian allies fighting under their own banner, mixed with the Roman troops of the government, make their stand outside the walls. It comes very close to going wrong for Sulla. His left wing collapses. Driven back through the night, some of his soldiers actually make it to the walls of Rome, pounding on the gates and begging to be let in. The right wing, where Sulla himself commands, holds and eventually prevails. By morning, the battle is over. Sulla enters Rome. And now he is 60 years old, give or take, and he has been fighting for his survival and his supremacy for a decade. He has seen what happens when you leave enemies standing. He has watched Rome's institutions be used against him repeatedly. The emergency decrees, the transfers of command, the mob violence, all of it deployed by men who operated through the legitimate apparatus of the Republic to destroy him. He understands, at a level deeper than ideology, that institutions are not neutral. They are tools, and tools can be taken up by whoever gets to them first. He's going to remake the tools, But first, he's going to make sure there is no one left with the incentive and the capability to stop him. There is one more thing to understand about Sulla before we look at the machinery he builds, and it is perhaps the strangest thing about him. He is, in some genuine sense, a man of culture. The bohemian associations of his early years are not simply a product of poverty. He maintained them when wealth made them optional. He wrote in Latin and Greek. He composed memoirs and light verse. He spent time with actors and writers throughout his life, including during his years of greatest power. He had genuine friends among people who were not politically useful to him, which is rarer among the powerful than it sounds. This coexistence of culture and cruelty, of genuine warmth and bureaucratic mass murder, is not a contradiction. It is the specific horror of men like Sulla, men who are not monsters in every dimension of their being, who contain real humanity alongside their capacity for systematic atrocity. He is not someone who kills because he cannot feel. He is someone who kills because he has decided that the killing is necessary, and his capacity for warmth with people he values exists in a separate compartment from his capacity for administrative murder of people he has placed in a different category. Understanding this about Sulla is important because it prevents us from dismissing him as simply evil, which is both historically inaccurate and, paradoxically, too comforting. An entirely evil man is rare and recognizable. A man who is genuinely charming, genuinely capable, genuinely human in some dimensions, and genuinely monstrous in others, this is common. This is the template that history repeats with dispiriting regularity. He sits down. He makes a list. On the day after the Battle of the Colline Gate, Sulla holds a meeting in the Temple of Bellona, the goddess of war. He has called together the Senate and a large number of other prominent Romans, and while they are assembled, listening to him speak, screaming begins. It comes from outside the temple walls. The screaming of a large number of men, screaming in the particular way that men scream when they are being killed. And it goes on long enough that the senators in the temple cannot pretend not to hear it. It goes on. And Sulla, addressing the assembled Romans, tells them not to be alarmed. He says that some criminals are being punished. Nothing to concern them. Please pay attention to what he is saying. He is having 6,000 prisoners from the Battle of the Colline Gate killed outside. All at once, the screaming of 6,000 men being executed, drifting through the walls of the temple, while the new master of Rome discusses the political future with the Senate. This is not an accident. This is not Sulla being sloppy about timing or indifferent to optics. This is Sulla sending a message with the precision that defines everything he does. The message is, I am speaking to you from inside a sound, the sound of what happens to people who oppose me. You are listening to me while that sound continues, and you are not leaving, and we both understand what that means. He is telling them, without saying it directly, that they serve at his pleasure now, and that his pleasure has a soundtrack. Understand what Sulla is building in these first weeks after the Colline Gate. He is not simply killing people. He is constructing a system, and the system has several interlocking components that, taken together, represent something genuinely new in the history of political violence, not just in Rome, but in the ancient world generally. The first component is legality. This is the part that deserves the most attention, because it is the part that is most easily misunderstood. The proscriptions are not Sulla abandoning the law. They are Sulla using the law. He is declared dictator, legally by the proper constitutional procedure, by a vote of the comitia. The dictatorship is an old Roman institution, created precisely for emergencies, when the normal, deliberate machinery of republican government was too slow. Dictators had been appointed before, and they always served for a limited term, 6 months, and then stepped down. Sulla's dictatorship has no time limit. He changes the rules, but he changes them through the rules. He has himself appointed in the correct form, with the correct votes, with the correct magistrates performing the correct rituals, and then, as dictator, he posts the prescription lists. Legally, officially, as an act of state, he is not a mob, he is not a murderous general running amok. He is the legitimate government of Rome, exercising the legal powers of the highest office in the state, and he is announcing that the following people are outside the law. The killing that follows is, in the most grotesque possible sense, lawful. The paperwork is in order. This is why the prescriptions matter so much beyond their body count. The body count is horrifying. We will come to it in a moment. But atrocities with high body counts are not actually rare in ancient history. What is rare, what makes this specific atrocity historically important, is the mechanism. Sulla has demonstrated that the apparatus of legitimate government can be turned into a tool for the organized murder of citizens, and that this can be done in such a way that each individual step is technically correct, even as the overall result is monstrous. Every ambitious man who comes after him will study this demonstration very carefully. The second component is incentivization. The proscriptions do not depend on Sulla personally hunting down and killing 1,700 Roman nobles. He does not have enough soldiers for that, and even if he did, using soldiers for this kind of work creates its own problems. So he creates a bounty system. The reward for killing a prescribed man is 2 talents. A talent is roughly what a skilled laborer might earn in 5 or 6 years. 2 talents is a fortune, meaningful to almost anyone in Rome, transformative to a poor man, substantial even to a moderately wealthy one, and the reward is available to anyone. A slave who kills his prescribed master receives 2 talents and his freedom. A freedman, a citizen, a foreign visitor, anyone may collect. What Sulla has built with this bounty system is something with its own terrible elegance. He has distributed the violence. He has made the killing of prescribed men into something that happens spontaneously across Rome and eventually across Italy, driven by private incentive rather than requiring central coordination. Bounty hunters appear in the streets. Men with something to gain, a debt owed by a prescribed man, a grudge, a desire for quick wealth, become Sulla's agents without being in any formal sense his employees. The system runs itself. And then there is the property, the estates, the money, the businesses, the investments of the prescribed men. All of this is confiscated by the state and auctioned. The auctions are nominally public and nominally fair, but in practice they are conducted under conditions that make fairness impossible. Who is going to bid against Sulla's associates for property that Sulla has seized? The auctions are a mechanism for wealth transfer from the prescribed classes to the men Sulla favors, and they operate on a massive scale. The man who benefits most visibly from this process is Marcus Licinius Crassus, who, in 82 BCE, is a reasonably wealthy young Roman with good connections and a genius for opportunity. Crassus moves through the prescription auctions like a shark through water. He buys at fractions of market value. He acquires properties, businesses, improved land. By the time the prescriptions end, Crassus is on his way to becoming the wealthiest man in Rome. Wealthiest, it will later be said, in all of Roman history. His wealth is built on the estates of murdered men. He will use this wealth to fund the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey, and the first triumvirate will be one of the mechanisms through which the Republic dies. The murdered men's money, transformed through Crassus into political capital, goes on doing its work for decades. There is a bureaucratic detail in the proscription system that deserves special attention because it illuminates something important about how organized violence scales. In the days after the first list is posted, a practical problem emerges. The list contains names, but Rome is a large city with a fluid population, and not everyone named on the list is known by sight to the bounty hunters searching for them. Several of the proscribed men have already fled, gone to country estates, gone to friends' houses, gone north or south into Italy. Sulla's solution to the identification problem is elegant in a grim way. He instructs that the heads of killed men must be brought to him personally for verification before the reward is paid. This creates a system in which Sulla himself is the final validation point for every killing, the human equivalent of a database that confirms whether a given person is actually on the list and whether the right person has been killed. It also means that Sulla sits repeatedly over the course of weeks and months, looking at severed human heads and pronouncing on their identities. Ancient sources record him doing this with a composure that they find remarkable. He examines the heads with the same attention and thoughtfulness he brings to military planning. He makes comments. Sometimes he makes jokes. Not vicious jokes, not the jokes of a man enjoying cruelty, but the kind of dry, oblique humor that is characteristic of his general manner. As if the heads are merely an administrative inconvenience that he is handling with appropriate professional detachment. What we are watching here is a man who has fully completed the psychological process of categorization that makes large-scale violence possible. The people whose heads are presented to him are not, in his internal processing, fully equivalent to the people he drinks with and tells jokes with and leads into battle. They have been reclassified. They are proscripti, the listed, the condemned. The administrative category overrides the human one. This is not unique to Sulla. It is the cognitive technology that makes every political purge possible, the replacement of the individual human being with a categorical status, and the treatment of the category rather than the person. The third component is escalation. The initial list contains about 80 names. This is already a large number. 80 senators and equestrians represents a significant slice of the Roman political elite. But the lists do not stop at 80. They grow for weeks and then for months, and the criteria for inclusion become progressively less clear. Sulla adds names himself. His associates recommend names. Local officials in the towns of Italy, eager to settle old scores or eliminate rivals, send suggestions to Rome. Some names appear on the lists because the men in question had been active Marian supporters. Some appear because they owe money to Sulla's allies and their assets are wanted. Some appear because they were denounced by slaves or by neighbors with grievances. Some appear, ancient sources claim, because Sulla simply wanted their fish ponds or their country houses. There is a moment that Valerius Maximus records, the kind of detail that lodges in the mind because of its compressed horror. A man who had been an enemy of a proscribed person goes to the list and adds a name. Not because Sulla told him to, not because there is a formal process for public nominations. He just adds a name, his enemy's name. And the man is duly killed, and the property duly confiscated, and the denouncer receives his reward. The list has become participatory. Citizens are writing each other's death warrants. This is what happens when the state signals that a certain category of human being is outside its protection. Once the category exists, once the state has said that these people can be killed without consequence, the boundary of the category becomes negotiable, drifting, available to anyone with sufficient malice and sufficient connection to the system. Sulla does not have to manage this directly. It manages itself. Consider the ground-level texture of what Rome looks like in late 82 and early 81 BCE. You wake up in the morning and you do not know if your name is on the list. You do not know if someone has denounced you, if a neighbor with a grudge has sent a letter, if your face has been recognized by someone who wants your house. The safest thing to do is to stay inside. But staying inside means you are not at your business, not managing your affairs, and your absence begins to look like guilty knowledge. Like you know you are prescribed and are hiding. Going out is dangerous. Staying in is dangerous. Every interaction has a new valence. Your slave knows that he can earn freedom and 2 talents by reporting you. Your freedman knows that loyalty to a prescribed patron is itself punishable. Your friends know that sheltering you makes them accessories. There is a recorded case of a son who turned in his own father and collected the reward. There is a recorded case of a man who was killed because he sheltered a prescribed friend in his house. The sheltering man's name was then added to the list as punishment. The network of social trust on which everyday life depends has been methodically poisoned. We should talk about the numbers, though we should do so with appropriate humility about ancient sources. Plutarch gives a figure of roughly 1,500 notable Romans killed in the proscriptions, meaning senators and equestrians. Appian's numbers are somewhat different. The ancient sources agree that the scale was enormous and unprecedented. Modern historians, working from the evidence available, tend to estimate that the proscriptions killed somewhere between 1,500 and several thousand men from the upper classes, with an uncertain but likely substantial number of lower-class victims. Freedmen, slaves, the associates and household members of proscribed men who were killed for proximity or potential loyalty. The Solon veterans deserve attention too, because they are the other arm of this redistribution. 120,000 soldiers settled on confiscated Italian land. This is an enormous number, representing a massive social transformation of the Italian countryside. Whole towns lose their territory. Entire communities are displaced to make room for Sulla's veterans, who arrive with their weapons and their allotments and their absolute loyalty to the general who gave them both. The displaced communities do not disappear. They become a pool of grievance, of economic desperation, of men with property claims and no property, sitting in the Italian towns that ring their former land, and watching Sulla's soldiers work it. This pool of grievance will not fully drain for decades. It will contribute to the instability of the period after Sulla's death, the various upheavals that characterize the generation between Sulla and Caesar. The proscription system also creates a specific kind of informant economy that has long-term social costs, even after the terror officially ends. Slaves who betrayed masters, neighbors who denounced neighbors, friends who reported friends. All of these people are living in Rome and in the Italian towns after the proscriptions are over. The social fabric that was poisoned does not simply repair itself when the dictator says the lists are closed. The betrayals are known. The informants are known. The social distrust created by an organized political purge has a half-life that is much longer than the purge itself. Romans of the generation after Sulla grew up knowing that their neighbors had been capable of informing on each other for money, that the state had rewarded this, that the institutions that were supposed to protect citizens had instead been weaponized against them. This shapes how they think about trust, about civic obligation, about the relationship between citizens and the state. It makes them more cynical, more individualistic, more likely to see political engagement as a game of survival rather than a genuinely civic act. This cynicism is itself a resource for the next generation of strong men. Men who are cynical about institutions are easier to lead by a charismatic individual who promises order and delivery rather than by a complex system of law and representation. The proscriptions did not just kill people. They killed a certain kind of civic faith, and the death of that faith made the autocracy that followed easier to accept. Here is something that almost no one tells you about Sulla, because it does not fit the story we expect, and because it is, frankly, very strange. In 79 BCE, approximately 3 years after the prescription's end, Lucius Cornelius Sulla resigns the dictatorship. He simply steps down. He walks out of the forum, offers himself to any citizen who wants to call him to account for what he has done, and when no one takes him up on it, because of course no one takes him up on it, he retires to his estate in the countryside near Puteoli, in the Campanian hills, where he writes his memoirs and goes fishing and drinks wine and dies the following year. He is 60. His health has been deteriorating. Ancient sources describe a wasting illness, possibly liver disease, and in his final months a particularly horrible symptom in which worms apparently bred in his flesh, a description that modern readers tend to receive with either skepticism or alarm. Whether or not the worm detailed is literal, the broader picture is clear. The man who remade Rome died in a country house, voluntarily, having given up the power that everyone assumed he would hold until death or assassination took it from him. Why? This is a question that has occupied historians for 2,000 years, and there is no satisfying answer, only theories. Appian says Sulla believed he had accomplished what he set out to do, restored the Senate's authority, rebuilt the Republic's institutions, secured his own legacy, and that there was nothing left requiring his personal presence. Plutarch is more psychologically interesting, suggesting that Sulla had a kind of fatalism about power, that he had always seen himself as the instrument of fortune rather than its master, and that when fortune seemed to have moved on, he moved with it. The most cynical explanation, and perhaps the most interesting, is that Sulla understood something about power that most men in his position never figure out. The moment you lose it, you are finished. Better to choose your moment than to be chosen. By resigning before anyone could force him out, he preserved the myth of his invincibility. No one defeated Sulla. Sulla decided to stop. There is also the possibility, perhaps the most human explanation, that he was simply exhausted. That 3 decades of warfare and political terror, of marching armies and compiling lists and examining severed heads in the forum, had ground something essential out of him, and that the country house and the fishing rod and the wine were not a political calculation but a collapse. A very quiet, very private collapse by a man who had held himself together through force of will for 60 years and had run out of will. He dies in 78 BCE and is given a state funeral of extraordinary magnificence, the most lavish, according to Plutarch, that Rome had ever seen. The body is carried through the city on a golden litter. The bier is attended by virtually the entire elite of Rome, men who had spent the preceding years terrified of him, men whose relatives he had killed, men who had bent every principle they held to survive under his dictatorship, all of them processing through the streets with appropriate solemnity, performing grief for a man who made grief their permanent condition. It is a very Roman moment. The capacity to perform exactly what the moment requires, regardless of what you actually feel, is perhaps the definitive Roman political skill. Now let us talk about what he left behind. The immediate human cost is the part we know least about in some ways, because the people most affected have the least presence in the historical record. Roman historians recorded the deaths of senators and equestrians, the people who left written traces, whose families were prominent enough to be mentioned. The slaves killed for suspected loyalty to their proscribed masters, the freedmen murdered as accessories, the wives and children who died in poverty after their husbands and fathers were killed. These people appear only as shadows at the edges of the sources. We know they existed. We cannot recover their names. What we can recover is some texture. The widows of proscribed men lost their dowries along with their husbands. Dowries, under Roman law, should have reverted to the wife or her family. But the prescription process stripped everything, and Sulla's rules redefined what counted as confiscatable property. Women who had married into prominent families found themselves not only bereaved but destitute, and there was no appeal. The sons of proscribed men sometimes managed to survive and even rebuild, but always under the shadow of their father's condemnation, always aware that their family's name was on a list of traitors posted in Rome's central square. Children who were young during the proscriptions grew up in a Rome where the central fact of their political education was that the state could decide to kill your father, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. This is not an abstraction. This is the formative experience of an entire generation of Romans. Sulla's constitutional reforms, the actual political settlement he creates as dictator, are sweeping and in many ways technically sophisticated. He doubles the size of the Senate, adding 300 new members to the existing 300, drawing largely from the equestrian class. He restricts the powers of the tribunes of the plebs dramatically. The tribunes had been the instrument of popular politics, the office that reformers like the Gracchi and rabble-rousers, like Sulpicius Rufus, had used to mobilize the popular assemblies against the Senate, and Sulla hates them for it. He reorganizes the courts. He establishes clearer rules for the sequence of magistracies that a Roman politician must hold. He tries to restore the Senate to its pre-Gracchian supremacy and to close off the mechanisms by which popular politicians had been able to circumvent senatorial authority. These reforms last approximately 10 years. They are substantially dismantled almost immediately after Sulla's death, because Sulla's constitutional settlement was entirely dependent on Sulla being alive and terrifying to enforce it. The moment he was gone, the same structural pressures reasserted themselves, and Rome's politics resumed their chaotic trajectory. But here is what does not go away. Here is what Sulla's legacy actually is, underneath the failed reforms and the fish ponds and the country house retirement. Sulla demonstrated that a Roman general with a personal army could march on Rome and win. This had never been done before him. It was done 3 more times after him. Pompey's military dominance of the eastern Mediterranean is undergirded by the implicit threat that Sulla established. Caesar crosses the Rubicon in 49 BCE, and the whole Roman world knows exactly what he's doing, because Sulla did it first. When Octavian, the future Augustus, takes his veterans and marches on Rome in 44 BCE, still a teenager, still technically just a private citizen, he is executing a play from a book that Sulla wrote. Sulla demonstrated that the prescription mechanism worked, that you could list your enemies, make their killing legal and profitable, confiscate their property, and do all of this while remaining technically within the forms of Roman law. The head of Marcus Tullius Cicero is displayed in the Roman Forum in December of 43 BCE. He is 63 years old at the time of his death, hunted down near his country estate as he attempts to flee to Greece, killed by soldiers sent by Mark Antony, whose career Cicero had been trying to destroy with his famous Philippic speeches. His hands are cut off along with his head. His right hand specifically, the hand that held the pen that composed the speeches. The Forum of Rome, where Sulla first posted his lists 60 years before, receives the severed hands of the man who tried hardest to articulate why those lists were wrong. The machinery repeating. The men who ordered Cicero's killing, Antony, Octavian, Lepidus, the Second Triumvirate, explicitly used prescriptions as the mechanism. They posted lists, they offered bounties, they confiscated property. They killed between 200 and 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians. They did it efficiently, quickly, modeled directly on the Sullan precedent. Octavian, who will become Augustus, who will become the first emperor, who will be remembered as one of the greatest rulers in Roman history, signs off on Cicero's name being added to the list. He is 20 years old. History sanitizes Augustus because he eventually builds something durable. But the Augustus who emerges from the civil wars and builds the Principate is a man who learned his trade in the proscriptions, who put his name on a list that got Cicero killed, who understood from his earliest political experience that power in Rome is ultimately backed by the willingness to be comprehensively ruthless. He learns from Sulla and from Caesar and from his own early mistakes, and what he learns is that Sulla's method had a structural flaw. The proscriptions created enemies. They created a large population of people who had reasons to want the Sullan settlement overturned. These people could not act immediately, but they constituted a latent opposition that emerged as soon as Sulla's personal authority was removed. Augustus, building the Principate, minimizes this problem. He is ostentatiously merciful after his final victory over Antony. He incorporates former enemies into his new system rather than exterminating them. He creates the institutions of the Principate with enough redundancy and enough apparent continuity with the Republic that the people who might have opposed a naked monarchy are disarmed. The Senate still meets. Elections still happen. Magistracies are still filled. The fiction of continuity is maintained with great care. The result is a system that survives its founder. When Augustus dies in 14 CE, there is no collapse. The Principate continues, passing to Tiberius, then to Caligula, then to Claudius and Nero, and onwards, through successions, sometimes violent and sometimes peaceful, for 500 more years in the West and more than 1,000 in the East. Sulla is, in this reading, the man who made Augustus necessary. By demonstrating that the Republic could not survive without a strong man, and that a strong man could not govern through Republican institutions without repeatedly resorting to terror, he established the structural argument for the Principate, for the polite fiction of one-man rule that would define the Roman world for centuries. The victims of the proscriptions, the 1,500 nobles and the uncounted thousands of others, are not remembered individually. A few names appear in the historical sources, mostly because they were prominent enough to be worth mentioning or because their deaths had ironic or dramatic qualities. The majority are simply gone, absorbed into the aggregate horror of the numbers. Their families, in many cases, are gone too, erased through poverty and political exclusion and the slow attrition of generations without inheritance or office. This erasure is itself a kind of victory for Sulla's method. One of the functions of political terror is not just to eliminate current enemies, but to eliminate the capacity for organized memory of the atrocity, because organized memory creates organized grievance, and organized grievance creates organized opposition. By killing the people who had the most reason to preserve and transmit the memory of what was done to them, Sulla ensures that the proscriptions are recorded primarily by historians who, whatever their sympathy for the victims, are writing from a safe distance and a stable perspective. There is a question that circles this whole story, the question I raised at the very beginning and want to return to now. Did Sulla believe his terror was necessary? Did he believe he was saving Rome? The memoirs he wrote in his final year apparently argued yes, that everything he did was required by the circumstances, that the proscriptions eliminated genuine enemies of order, that the reforms would have been impossible without the clearing of the ground they required. He presents himself as an instrument of Fortuna, the goddess of luck who had favored him throughout his career. He was not, in his own account, a man who chose violence for its own sake. He was a man who chose what was necessary. But here is the problem with that argument, and it is the same problem that echoes through every account of politically organized mass murder from antiquity to the present. Necessity is always retrospective. Necessity is always defined by the person who commits the violence. The question of whether something was truly necessary, whether the 1,500 nobles killed in the proscriptions represented a genuine existential threat to Roman order, or whether many of them were killed for property reasons, for personal grudges, for Sulla's allies' economic benefit, is precisely the question that the person doing the killing is the least qualified to answer. Sulla did not save the Republic. He showed the people who would eventually destroy it how to do so. He handed them the tools. The proscription lists, the personal armies, the march on Rome, the conversion of constitutional forms into instruments of personal power. All of these things outlasted him and did their work long after his death. Lucius Cornelius Sulla died in his country house with his memoirs completed, satisfied, as far as we can tell, with what he had done. The fishing rod by the door, the smell of salt water from the Campanian coast, and in the Forum of Rome, 40 miles north, his work continued without him. His tools remained available to anyone willing to pick them up. His precedents hardened into history, and history hardened into possibility, and possibility, as it always does, eventually hardened into fact. He told Rome what it was capable of, and Rome, being Rome, took careful notes.